I love the fact that the guild has become more diverse. I think it's it's an honor to be a member, and the board should feel so proud because I speak to people all over the country from work, and I don't know that there's any other guild that's experiencing this kind of growth and this increased diversity. And so it's a very exciting place now. I love seeing new faces and I love the new perspectives. So it's become it's become an increasingly exciting place.
Hello and welcome to the New York Guild of Handweavers Member Spotlight. My name is Katie Clements and I'm the membership chair of the Guild. With almost 200 members, the New York Guild of Handweavers provides inspiration, information, and mutual support to anyone interested in weaving, tapestry, spinning, or fiber arts through speakers, workshops, as well as our lending library. Go to nyhandweavers.org for more information. Today we will talk with New York Guild member Susan Weltman. Susan is a retired family therapist. Her love of textiles began long before she began weaving. She grew up at a time and in a family where many women sewed their own clothes. Her grandmother and her mother both sewed beautiful clothing for her and her sister. One of her first purchases in college was a sewing machine. The idea of being able to dress and adorn herself to her own taste has always been important to her. Having always loved cloth, textiles, color, and decoration, she has been weaving scarves, shawls, and blankets for many years now. She has traveled to every continent, and the colors, textures, plants, and people she sees informs her work. She considers herself fortunate to live in New York City, where she can visit museums and galleries frequently for ideas and stimulation. Susan weaves with an 8-harness, 48-inch wide floor loom, preferring to work with silk or wool, or a combination of the two. She's beginning to work with natural dyes, finding as many dye plants as she can in Brooklyn Bridge Park, close to where she lives. In addition to being a member of the New York Guild of Handweavers, Susan is a member of the Textile Study Group of New York and Weave a Real Piece, and has been a board member of these organizations. Welcome, Susan.
A pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here. So, as a fellow Guild member, I know you have a history of weaving and fiber art, so I'd like to hear a bit about yourself, your background, and how you got started in fiber art.
Well, one thing that's always very funny to me is I feel like it was just yesterday, and then I count the years, and it was not yesterday. I come from a family, my grandmother was a seamstress, my mother sewed and knit, and so that was just part of my life. But I always was interested in how things start, like making bread or making my own jam, the beginning of things. And so, and always loved the color of textiles. So when my son left for college in '85, I started taking a weaving class at a school and a shop in Clinton, New Jersey, which doesn't exist anymore. And that was really when I started. My parents bought me my first loom, which was a shack 4-harness. And the first warp I put on it, I was really upset because obviously the loom was broken because I couldn't get a good shed. And I must have had somebody who lived nearby who came over and pointed out that I had crossed threads and the loom was not broken. So that was a real learning experience. And from that, I went taking classes at going to Convergence. The first Convergence I went to was in Portland in, I think, '98, Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver and Cincinnati. So I started going to Convergence and taking classes. Eventually spent some time at Haystack and at in North Carolina at Penland. So continued to take classes, but most meaningful for me in learning was being part of a weaving class at the Newark Museum. And that I was working full-time. Professionally, I've been a family therapist. I have an MSW, and I worked with seriously mentally ill teenagers for many, many years in an adolescent inpatient unit. And when I retired, and colleagues would see me on the street and they would say, "You look so relaxed." And I said, because I don't wake up in the morning and think, is he going to kill his mother or himself? I think, blue or green, silk or wool. So yes, I'm more relaxed. But when I stopped working full time and just worked part time, I started taking this class at the Newark Museum. And over the 10 years or so, I was in that class. We only met for about 16 weeks a year, but they were very significant weeks because we had a class of maybe 10 people, and some of us came all the time. Daryl Lancaster was one of our teachers, and we also had a class in sewing, handwovens. And the curator would bring textiles for us to see in class. And one of the best things about it was that we had a wall full of yarn, silk, wool, cotton, every color under the sun that had been contributed over the years. So we could make mistakes, we could screw up. We could start a warp and just hate it, or find out it was messy and cut it off, and we weren't losing hundreds of dollars. And over the course of the time, we had probably 6 different teachers, and all of them had different strengths, but were terrific. So that was a very, very formative experience. And unfortunately, about 10, 12 years ago, the museum, in a very short-sighted way, just got rid of the workshop, because I would have continued to go. It was really a wonderful experience for me.
It sounds like it. When I hear someone's taking classes, I don't imagine it to be that in depth and for that long of
Well,
time. So
we called it our weaving. Donna Ritter's one of the people who was in that class, and Susan Mayo. We called it the Weaving Support Group, because eventually we were on the internet, but at the beginning we were not. But you could call each other and ask for advice, and go to shows together. It was just a fabulous experience. And we had people. New Jersey's a relatively small state, so we had people from all over the state, and it was an incredibly diverse community. So it was great.
wow, that sounds like a
Don't miss
great
it.
experience.
Yeah.
And tell me about how Haystack and Penland were to go and immerse yourself in.
Well, Haystack, for one thing, I was lucky when it was warm. I went there when it was warm, because there's no heating and it's right by the ocean in Maine. And I know other people, it can be very cold. And I know people who've had a pretty uncomfortable experience. So we had a very good experience. And I took a class in natural dyeing with Roland Ricketts. And I've taken classes. I've been very lucky. I've taken classes with India Flint. I've taken classes with other well-known dyers. But this was 2 weeks, and he's a wonderful teacher. And we were not doing indigo, because he won't make an indigo pot just for 2 weeks, but we were just using local plants. And that was a very, very positive experience. It was really great.
So who are your a couple favorite weaving teachers that come to mind?
Oh, well, Beth Silvershack, who's a member of the Complex Weaver, and the Philadelphia Guild, is very important in my life. She was one of the teachers, and she does a lot of Swedish weaving. She spends a lot of time at VAV, at the school in Massachusetts. So she was a wonderful, wonderful teacher. Pam Paul, who's now in Florida, also who does classes online. She's a very good teacher. So if people have an opportunity to take a class with her, I would strongly recommend it.
You're the third person in this interview series that's mentioned Pam Paul.
Well, she's talks more about using your feelings or your experience in your work than any teacher I've ever had. So during the pandemic, when we were hardly going outside, one of the classes was about sound. And it gave me the opportunity to, walking was all we could do by ourselves at that time. And it tuned me into things in my environment and ways to reflect it in my work. So she is very influential in that way. She's a terrific teacher. in the class, because I was at the class in Newark for so many years, two of the people in that class whose work I followed, one is Kate Barber, who was there. She's a member of the textile study group, and she does absolutely beautiful work. She does natural dyeing, and people should look up her website, which is katebarber.com. And when I first met her, she was a young mother with two kids trying to find the time to work. And I followed her. She moved to Vancouver, and then she moved back to the States. And it's just been fascinating to me to see how her work has developed. She uses a lot of she was using a lot of sort of differential shrinkage. And she's brilliant. And another person who was also in the class is Susie Taylor, who's quite well known now for her origami weaving. And when she started, she was like Kate, a mother with two young kids, just trying to find the time to work. And she knew what she was interested in pursuing. But at the time I knew her best, she didn't know how to get there. And she just pursued it and pursued it and pursued it until she got to doing this brilliant work with origami on the loom. And I'm not like that. I do not have that persistence. I know that.
I think all weavers are persistent to some degree.
Yeah, yes. So often people make a differentiation between the technical and the color people. Beth Silvershack is definitely a technical person. I mean, she's an engineer in her mind. And so she would always find ways to get the looms at the museum to work more efficiently. She was always aware of things like that were not on my mind. And I'm much more of a color person. So I love double weave. It's a pain in the ass to set up and weave, but I really like that. But color more than structure. I have an 8 harness loom. I have thankfully no computers connected to it. It's an AVL home loom. So unlike a shack, you don't have to get on the ground to set it up. It's 48 inches wide, 8 harnesses, and that's fine with me. I understand it. If something goes wrong, I can see what it is and I can fix it. So that's nice for me.
Yeah. Well, you talked about seeing others progress. How would you describe your weaving when it's first started, or your fiber art when it first started, and your fiber art today?
I think I've stopped progress. I'm not that interested in change, which is okay with me. I like where I am, which is a nice, which you don't hear many people say. And I haven't said that often in my life. I love weaving with silk. I love weaving with wool and silk mainly. I do some natural dyeing. I do some indigo dyeing. During the pandemic, I took courses with Mawa and botanical colors on different kinds of dyes, and I can set up my apartment reasonably well, so I can have dye pots there. So I would say that what I've moved towards is more natural dyeing. From a time when I just, bought the colored yarns and worked with it. So I do like doing shibori. I have little bits here.
And I have a Susan Weltman pillow.
Right, you do indeed. Yes. Yeah. So and I also have started doing pillows with some of the scraps that I have,
Cool.
which has been fun. So the progression has been towards more natural dyeing, certainly. I right now, the next project I'm gonna have on the loom are 3 warp with 3 silk scarves that are white or tan, and blanks that I'll use for dyeing, because I don't like using commercial scarves. I like to use my own. So Those three, at least one or two will be dyed with indigo. The third one, I'm not sure.
Now, I'm not a dyer, but I know when I'm weaving, kind of
Yet.
you, you're you might be changing that for me. Why is dyeing so appealing?
Well, I'm not a rigid perfectionist by far. So I I'm good at following the instructions. I mean, I don't feel confident enough to just sort of say, well, let me put in a little more of this or a little more of that. It's very new to me. It's very sort of foreign. And I'm a cook who follows the recipes, so it's not surprising I do the same with dyeing. But getting these kinds of forms, without having to do it on the loom, it still feels like a miracle. It's just it's exciting. And one of the last classes I took in Mawa was a rust dyeing class. And so my neighborhood, which is right near Red Hook, has a lot of ironmongers, a lot of people who work in iron. And so I was going around talking to these guys and collecting scraps, and man, is it heavy. Wow. One time I went out on my bike, and that was a big mistake. You can't carry, you end up with 30 pounds of iron, right? Yeah. But and that's interesting because it's much more experiment. I'm going to show you a piece. So this is with rust and iron, and I started doing a little embroidery on it, but I'm not sure where that's going to go. And this is my favorite. I haven't done any of that on any of my hand woven scarves. I've done it on some of machine woven fabric that I bought. And you have to be very careful because it can abrade the fabric so easily because it's rust. But that's interesting as a weaver because it's not it's weaving is so structured to be perpendicular. This is so wild, even more than shibori, because shibori you're stitching in a way that you pretty much what you're getting. You're getting this or you're getting this, but with this kind of thing, it's wild. And so that's really stepping out of the box of being a weaver to get to that kind of wild.
Well, when you make the connection with cooking and how gratifying it is when it's finished, and that really clicks for me on how. So when it comes on the other side, you have this magical surprise.
And with
way
cooking, you eat it and it's gone here.
Yeah.
But in India Flint, who does wrapping of flowers, the class I took with her, somebody said, well, how do you get consistency? How do you get the same thing next time? And she was standing there in this wild dress, sort of like this. And she said, does it look like I care about consistency? And so using the rusty iron is giving up that control, because you really don't know. You have a little idea, but a lot of it you don't know.
So you have traveled to every continent.
Indeed.
So I'm curious how your traveling has influenced your weaving and dyeing.
Well, for one thing, some of the trips I've been to, we'll talk more about Weave a Real Piece, but I've been to Guatemala and Oaxaca with Warp. So those trips were very focused on meeting dyers and weavers. And my husband, who is very supportive of my patient and supportive of my interests, has been with me on a trip to Mali, which was also a textile oriented trip. Certainly the colors that we see the the weaving, the textiles we see, because almost every place, I mean, if you're in northern Thailand, all the women you see will have, or most of them will have indigo dyed arms and hands. Laos, northern Thailand, Vietnam. So seeing the work that people do certainly influences me. And their country, we took in Ghana, Stephen patiently went with me. The air conditioning was not working in the car, and we drove 2 hours to the last place in Ghana where they're still doing indigo in pits in the ground. And we had to take a dugout canoe across this little river to get over there. And it was hot as hell. And we participated in it. You know, I brought along a scarf to dye. It was just great. So we've both been big hikers. Steve was a climber, and I'm not a climber, definitely, but our trips have mainly involved hiking and seeing beautiful world. And so the colors really influence my work.
The colors that you see in nature when you travel, or
Yeah, yeah,
oh,
yeah.
okay.
And also you know, what people are wearing. It's sadly starting to change a lot, you know, as American cheap fashion spreads, or Western cheap fashion spreads. But
Can you talk about selling your work? How do you sell your work, and what's that
okay,
like?
well, there were more, up until 10, 15 years ago, there were many more small galleries around Highland Park, New Jersey, where I used to live, and Brooklyn, and there are not so many of them anymore. Cooperative galleries are not, and sometimes they would take things as consignment. Um, I usually participate in, as you saw this year, in one school bazaar,
Mhm.
partly because I like supporting public schools, but also it's a chance to get out in the community. Other than that, I just sell to friends or people on social media. It's I'm very fortunate in that I had a good job with a pension,
Mhm.
which young people have never heard of. You know, I have to explain what that is. So in addition to Social Security, I have a real pension. So I'm very lucky in that I didn't have to be a production weaver, and I haven't had to sell to make a living. And it changes people's lives, and I really understand that. But I've luckily not been in that position. So largely I'm selling to get my stuff out in the world. You know, I want people to be wearing things I've made and worked at and loved. The first time that somebody had a scarf stolen that I made, I was really flattered, and they were not happy. You know, they went to a salad bar and it was on the back of a chair, and they came back and it was gone. I was like, oh, how exciting.
Two owners now.
Yeah. But you know, I like knowing that my things are out in the world, the things I've worked on. I also appreciate it was different for my grandmother, who had to work as a seamstress because she had to support her family, and she did not have that pleasure in ownership because it was an obligation. So, you know, she didn't think about the brides who'd worn the dresses she made, because she knew she had to go back to the shop the next day and make another one. So I am in a very privileged position, and I realize that.
Yeah.
My grandmother worked in sweatshops and eventually became a foreman, and she hated it. And she did not want to teach her daughters to sew, so they snuck out of the house. Her three daughters snuck out to learn how to sew, which is pretty amazing.
Wow.
And none of them were nearly as good as she was. I mean, she did not have a store-bought dress till she was 90.
Wow.
And she would look at the seams of my clothing and go, she did not really approve of store-bought clothes. But none of her daughters were as good. And actually, I went to the Met Opera on Friday, and I wore a dress that my grandmother made.
Oh,
Or a silk velvet dress that my grandmother had made for me. It's one of two or three things I still own that she made. That was
that's
so, and I was with my mother was the oldest of many cousins, and Steve and I were at the opera with one of her younger cousins who's 86, but he was one of the kid cousins of my mother. So I was really exciting to wear this dress. I remember that velvet being in our family for years before we lived in Chicago, and there was a brown envelope and it had silk ribbons and it had that piece of black velvet. And eventually somehow it went back. So it was always there, and then it became a dress for me.
That was a pretty special piece of fabric to
Yeah,
be treated like
yeah,
that.
always in the
And
family.
you ended up with it. That's
Yes,
great.
and she waited till I was an adult to make it.
That was smart.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah,
I'd love to
okay.
hear about Weave a Real Piece.
The first meeting I went to, and they used to advertise in Handwoven. And the first meeting I went to was in South Carolina. It's where Martin Luther King Jr. wrote the I Have a Dream speech. And it was a school that was started by Quaker women during the Civil War. And it was the only place in the South that was never segregated. Um, they, the history is very interesting, but that was the first meeting I went to. And it was just in a very, very exciting place to be. And that was when I learned that the slaves or the enslaved people had brought indigo plants with them. And at that time, we always thought of indigo as being from India or other countries. And that's when I learned that there was a tradition. Rice and indigo were both brought from Africa by enslaved people. So this was an area that did grow indigo. And when we were there was a woman from Nigeria with an indigo pot. So I just felt like I had found my home among this community of largely women. And uh, they're just, it's just a very inspiring group. Deb Chandler, who wrote the book on learning to weave, started it 30 or some years ago. And she's still involved, and people like Brenda Rosenbaum, who lives in Albany, from Mayan Hands. And these are people who really live their convictions, their political convictions. And I've always been, since picketing Woolworths in 1960, I've always been very politically engaged. Being on a picket line or being at a demonstration has been a big part of my life. Writing letters, doing whatever we can. So the WARP members work both in this country and all over the world to make the lives of the makers better. And it's largely women, but not entirely. And during the pandemic, we were able to provide grants to people all over the world, and where $1,000 made a difference. The people could eat for a month or two. So everybody does wonderful, fascinating individual work to make the world a fairer place. And we have a good time. We have fun together. And one of the other things about it is that I know people all over the country and all over the world now. And Katie, you and I have talked about that a little bit, that we tend to know people where we went to school or where we live. And through WARP, I have very good friends who live in Oklahoma City. I have friends who live in small towns in Washington State and Colorado and Tennessee. In other circumstances, I would not know these people. But WARP does bring together people not only from all over the world, but all over the country. So I can visit almost any state and find a WARP member. I'm going to London in a few weeks, and I'll see one of our WARP members who's from Moscow, actually, but living in London. And 2 weeks ago, I spent an afternoon with a WARP member from Guatemala who was in New York, and Yasmin from Beirut. I see her when she comes, and it's just introduced me to these people from all over the world. And we were in Steve is trying to give away many, many books about Nigerian history and Nigerian literature because he taught in Nigeria in the 60s. And through Warp, one email with a woman at University of Michigan led him to somebody, a Nigerian scholar who's interested in these books. You know, I'm just like, that's
Well,
what, yeah, it's really been a big part of my life. And bicycling used to be a big part of my life, and I know you're a cyclist. I've cycled in China and Italy and France and Washington State and then in New York City until about 3 years ago when I was knocked over by a car, not seriously injured, and that led me to only ride on bike paths. That was pretty scary.
who and what do you find inspiring?
Well, even though I describe myself as not much of a risk taker, the people who are, I find inspiring. I still read Handwoven, and my eyes are mainly drawn to the articles about color. You know, this latest edition had a few things that really drew my eye. And people connecting with their heritage, you know, people working on projects that they can relate to something that they remember from their grandmother or somebody from where their family's from, because everybody in this country, except for a tiny minority, is from somewhere else. So it's all about connections. And when I see work like at the Roots show from the Textile Study Group, I'm really aware of what I can do and what I can't do. You know, there are ways people, some of my friends object when I say I'm not an artist, that I'm a weaver. But when I see some of the artwork that my friends do, I don't have the knowledge that Fanny has. I don't, and I could have gone back to school, but I didn't. And so I have some regrets about that. But I'm aware of where I'm at. And you know, there are things I just about, I understand the space that I see in front of me in my loom. But when I look at work for the wall, there's things about the space and spatial arrangements that I really don't know a lot about. I've taken a few classes at the Arts Students League, and I'm glad I took them. But there's a whole area of knowledge that I don't have, and I chose not to engage in that. So I do feel that I've got limits, but everybody does, and it's acceptable to me.
So when you do see go to galleries and you see something you really like, what is it about you? What impresses you when you look at other fiber artists' work?
Well, I think that I work on a very small scale. I mean, I can put something on the loom that's 48 inches, though I rarely do. But there's a larger scope that I would have to retrain myself to understand or be proficient at. You know, a larger, when you're weaving pretty traditional cloth, as I do, your colors are interacting in a way that has clear limits, no matter how many you use. And when you've got a larger palette, it's so much more expansive. I mean, this is a favorite of mine, and I've repeated this double weave. And you know, the red is an important part of it. Though when I do it again, I would put the red through the middle.
Ah.
And this is probably the second or third time I've done it, but it's a limited palette. And this is a double weave I did at the Newark Museum, and this is the having walls and walls of cotton and all the colors there. And this is where this pulls up
Mm.
the bottom layer,
Oh,
top.
okay.
So I've done this in silk. I've done this
Um,
in Zephyr, which is silk and wool,
Oh, that's great.
but it's constrained.
You know what? Let's
so-
show the slideshow.
So this was printed in a class I took. Uh, um, I can't remember how it was. This is very unusual for me, and I can't remember anything about it.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is. I
So
wish
it's a sewed woven piece onto a,
So it's cotton that I wove
Mhm.
and
Oh, there it is.
then printed on top of it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, great result.
yeah.
Okay.
So okay, one of my goals is to keep better notes. That's something I would recommend to everybody. All right, so that's Shibori with cochineal. That one I remember.
Wow. Let's see. Oh, and is this the one that I have? Yeah.
Yes, that is indeed.
I love this pillow. So it's silk on one side, and then this great backing cotton. So
And that obviously I spent hours and hours and hours stitching that.
beautiful. Wow.
That's a double weave, tensile, which I don't use that much, but that is a tensile double weave.
Was this done at Newark?
No, this I did here.
At home.
Yeah.
That's great.
And that's silk.
Ooh,
And
wow.
that is shadow weave, I think.
Oh, that's a great pattern.
Yeah. Yeah. That is wool. And actually it is going in the mail tomorrow to somebody who bought it.
All
A friend, yeah. So that's a very soft, lightweight wool.
beautiful. I
And
was so
those
curious about this one.
that is silk, and it is it's two different kinds of silk, and when it was dyed, obviously the first one, the darker one, stayed in the indigo longer, and the other one stayed in the indigo very slight time, but it just picked up the dye, the indigo, very differently.
Is it one scarf?
Those are two
Or
different
two
scarves.
different ones. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you like about working with indigo?
Well, it's a miracle. I mean, you can adjust the shades much more finely than you can with other dyes. But it's depending on how long you keep it in it. And there are also lots of different ways to make an indigo pot.
Mm.
But because I keep such shitty notes, I have an indigo pot in my laundry room, and I can't remember which recipe I used. You should never put away things like that without saying that it's whether it's, but I do. And that is a shibori pattern, and that is from that's a natural dye from Brooklyn Bridge Park, sumac. Those sumac berries that have been brewed, and so that was dyed with a plant from Brooklyn Bridge Park.
That is cool. I wouldn't think of that, that you get local.
And you can and I know which plants they don't mind me taking
Mhm.
from there, and you get a different color as the summer goes on. So it becomes slightly darker, it becomes darker, more purpley in the fall, which is, as soon as I learned that, it was obvious, but I hadn't realized that.
Oh,
And this is one of my favorite things, is deflected double weave. So that's silk, and that's a favorite of mine.
that is fun.
I really love, and the bottom is like an eyelash silk
Oh, okay.
down there. Yeah.
Oh, that's fun. Oh, love this. This is a photogenic scarf.
Yeah, but I really think the red should go through the middle.
How fun though to have like
Yeah.
the
Like
next
in this
version.
one, the red goes through the middle.
Let's see, and I think that might be, yeah,
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 I can see. And
yeah.
what material is
That's
this?
a Japanese cotton that I never have seen again. There was a little gallery in downtown Manhattan that was selling it, and I didn't know I was going to like it so much. And then I've never seen it again.
Oh,
So
that's so pretty.
that's one I don't sell. That's one I keep because I can't repeat it.
Now you're a collector too, right?
Yep, unfortunately. You can see in the background, you can see there's a wheat peel.
Wow.
There's two, those are wheat peels from Guatemala there and there. And that's a little rug from Norway. And there's some Peruvian hats up there.
Uh-huh.
And that painting is done by a friend of mine from a trip to Greece in 1981.
So
So
do you always, when you travel, you make sure to bring some textile?
not as much anymore. I mean, I'm giving away many things. One of the things I really appreciate from weaving and the weavers I met is the breadth of knowledge and the how many different skills or specialties or talents or interests there can be within that title. So you talk about weaving and you talk about natural dyeing, and within that, it encompasses such a range of people's interests. But it's also important to remember, just like I talked about my grandmother having to be a seamstress, that there are people all over the world who do this not by choice, but because it's what their families need to survive. So at the Newark Museum at one point, I was bringing in a portable loom, and there was a man working there who was African. And he said, I'm from Ghana, and that's what I used to do as a living, is to be a kente weaver. And I was like, oh my God, how fabulous.
Wow.
And he said, I'm very happy to be working in a parking lot. He said, weaving was not a passion. It was not something I chose. It was what my family did to survive. And working in a parking lot at Newark sounds great to me. So that was for me a real reminder that we're doing this from choice and love. And there are people over the world who do it because that's what they have to do. So we can make their lives easier and appreciate what they're doing, but it's important to remember we're choosing this. Shortly after, the museum had a show of African weaving, and they did invite him in. I was really glad that they did invite him in to walk through the show and talk to them about his perspective on it.
It's a nice way to honor and acknowledge
Yeah,
his
yeah.
him as a weaver.
But those kente weavers, they've got muscles. Man, oh man, are they built?
Wow.
And they are not lifting weights.
Wow. Is it that what motion is
It's the pounding it. It's the tight weave on a very primitive, on a backstrap loom.
Wow. What does being part of a guild mean to you?
Well, I love to see. I love the fact that the guild has become more diverse. I think it's an honor to be a member, and the board should feel so proud, because I speak to people all over the country from Warp, and I don't know that there's any other guild that's experiencing this kind of growth and this increased diversity. And so it's a very exciting place now. I love seeing new faces and I love the new perspectives. So it's become it's become an increasingly exciting place. And just the different things people are bringing in, and having a president who not only is a wonderful weaver, but understands how to do technology is just extraordinary, because the way that we've integrated people who can't be at the meeting with people who are at the meeting, without the technical snafus that most places have. And I recently invited a dear friend, Vanina from Buenos Aires, to join because I knew she'd be able to show her work from BA.
Wow.
So it's just become a very exciting place to interact with people.
Do you ever get discouraged, stuck on a project, unmotivated, and how do you move through that?
Around Christmas time, I decided I was looking at a British weaver on the internet that I personally needed to brighten up my colors for this season, that I was feeling pretty blue or crummy. And so I put on a much more colorful warp than I had been using for a while. And I hadn't thought about it beforehand that I was using much darker colors and that I needed to make a switch. So I was glad that I figured that out. I can be lazy and sloppy in putting on a warp. So that then causes so many problems. And when I can remember to put it on, to take the time to really make sure it's on firmly and on evenly, then I'm so happy. But I don't always do that because sometimes I'm not in the mood, and then I pay for it. I it's been a long time since I've absolutely cut off a warp. And I love the challenge of almost entirely using yarns I already own, and I got plenty of those, but that always provides a challenge. So I can usually work it through.
So what would you say to people starting out in fiber art?
Buy your products as inexpensively as you can, so you don't mind if you chop it off. Be in a position to be forgiving to yourself. You know, frankly, people die and leave stashes, people stop working and give things away. Treat yourself as much as you can to materials that it's not going to drive you crazy if you don't like what you do. Save the silk and the more expensive fibers for when even if you're kind of a newbie, if you're going to be slow and patient with it. But as much as possible, leave yourself in a position that you have the time and the freedom to experiment. You have to be willing to give up on some things at the beginning. And if you've spent $200 on your yarn, it's going to be harder.
So
and ask for help. These days with the internet, ask for help. So when you start out like I did and you think the loom is broken, you have somebody around who can tell you, no, it's not. Have an emergency service available to come in and say, well, you could do this or you could do that. And remember that the finished product is going to be great. You're going to be aware of this place where you didn't beat as hard as you did somewhere else, but there's a reason why we wash and finish everything, and it's not as long as you thought it was going to be because it was stretched on the loom, or it's not going to be as long. 6 months later, you're not going to remember that. You're going to wear it and people are going to say, that's gorgeous. Sure. So the things that are unexpected end up being part of the process. Paul Krugman was a hero of mine when he first started writing for the New York Times. I don't remember who was president then, but it one of the Bushes maybe. And he was teaching at Princeton. And I wanted to give him, there were pictures of him in the paper wearing a scarf, and it just didn't look that good. It was a shitty scarf. So I went to a fundraiser in Princeton that he was going to be at. I think it was even at his house. And I brought him a hand-woven scarf. So at the end I sent one to Princeton for him. I sent it there. But then I was told by somebody who worked at Princeton that he was such a controversial figure that they were afraid to give him his mail because they were afraid it was going to be a letter bomb. So I found out that he never got it. So I gave it to him at this meeting, and he looked at me like I was out of my mind. Like he'd had a lot of unexpected events in his life, but somebody walking up and saying, "You're a hero of mine, and I wove this for you," was not something he expected. And I hope he at least gave it to his kid or his dog or something like that.
Great. I love that story. That's so meaningful. Did you think of, did you have him in mind as you were weaving it?
Oh yeah, I knew it was for him.
Oh, he's probably wearing it right
The look
now.
on his face, like a hand woven skirt. Who is this woman? What is she doing? And when I found out, because I knew people at Princeton that they were not delivering mail to him, it just didn't occur to me that this would be taken to be a letter bomb.
So what's ahead for you in your weaving world,
Well,
your
I'm
fiber
making
art?
these white scarves, and then I'll have to do some dyeing again. I finally put away the table I use, so I'll have to do that. And meanwhile, I've got it up on the warping mill, and I'm getting ready to put it on the loom.
And the warp annual meeting.
Yep, going out to finally getting to falling water.
Yeah.
Yeah, which will be very exciting. And getting to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I've secretly always wanted to do. So secretly, I didn't even know that I wanted to do it.
Well, I'm glad you're fulfilling all these dreams.
Right. Anyway,
Well,
have a gorgeous day today.
yes, thank you. This has been so much fun.
Yes.
So cool. Well, thank you,
See you soon.
Susan. And thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please like, comment, and share, and subscribe to the New York Guild of Handweavers YouTube channel. If you're interested in joining the New York Guild of Handweavers, please go to nyhandweavers.org. See you in the next video, and until then, happy weaving.